Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Oh my!
Uh-oh.
Neat!
All right. Is everyone pumped for the debate today? So welcome our at least 2 people who are watching right now, and we'll get those rookie numbers up pretty soon. But
one of them is me.
Oh, the other might be me.
Yeah. That's all right. Let's do it. No audience. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, they'll trickle in eventually.
Yeah.
But yeah, so sorry about the delays. We had a couple of things. We were waiting on Cinematic, and she wanted to be here, but she ended up she's at a debate tournament that's ended up going a little too late. So yeah, I don't think she's debating, but she has some of her school kids are doing a debate tournament. So yeah, so she's here in spirit, and we've got at least one other person, and we've got our yep, I was about to say pretty much exactly that. Stupid Horror Energy is the only audience we need. And yeah, we haven't seen you in a while, and glad you're back today. And so today we are debating the topic of what is the exact wording of it? Moral absolutes exist, if I have that correctly. And we have Christopher Silvius as the affirmative, saying that moral absolutes do exist, and Mark Reid as the negative. And yeah, so if you guys wanted to introduce yourselves, or give the audience anything you're working on, anything that's coming up, go ahead. And I guess we'll start with Chris because he's the affirmative.
My name is Christopher Silvius. You can find that. I have a YouTube channel by that name. And then I believe the Bible is the inerrant, infallible, inspired word of the living God. That will be my basis for authority on the moral issue here tonight.
All righty. And Mark, if you got anything to say before we get started for real?
Hello, everybody. I am Mark Reid, and my position comes from a naturalistic position. I'm a secular humanist. I do debate, usually from a perspective of science and rationality, and I will be arguing the negative on do moral absolutes exist.
All righty, awesome. So we'll just get right into it. We'll have 10-minute openers, and we'll have a rebuttal phase and then an open discussion phase. And I'll you guys want me to interrupt at when you got a minute left? I think you said.
Fine.
Okay.
Yes, please.
And I'll do like some posts on the side chat. I'll bring up when you have like 3 minutes left and stuff too. And yeah, so why don't we have Chris go? You have 10 minutes.
All right. I'm going to share my screen here.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to do the entire screen to go back and forth between the two presentations. All right, then.
All right, and the timer will start whenever you start talking.
You see Psalms 12, 6, and 7 up there?
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
All right. It says, the words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord. Thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. The Bible claims that God's word have been preserved and that the Bible itself is those words. So you have to look at it from a historical argument. If I'm going to make any position to say that moral absolutes exist, I have to have some kind of authority. And if it's a secular authority, I have to have some kind of credentials, some kind of historical validation for this. And I believe that the Bible is, in fact, the greatest historical document ever written, claims to be preserved by God, passed around by the churches. When the epistles of the New Testament were written, it was circulated with the other scriptures that were already given. And that's kind of how we got it. We have a collection of 66 books that was written over the course of many generations from many different authors. People were put to death, by people like Mary of England for trying to translate from the original Greek and Hebrew text into the English, killed because that wasn't allowed. We know that the texts haven't changed. We can validate them by the ancient manuscripts. You can, I don't know how you would date them, but the same way you would date any other document, I guess. But we know that it's not the words that changed. It's the interpretation of those words that's kind of at issue, and that's why people were dying. But if you look at the development of the King James Version of the Bible, it is a culmination of a lot of work, that was done for many years before that translation. By 500 AD, the Bible had been translated into over 500 languages. Just 1 century later, it was restricted to the Latin Vulgate, so not legal to translate from the original Hebrew and Greek into any other language other than Latin. So those in possession of non-Latin scriptures would be executed. I'm just making the point that you don't have to argue. It's not necessary. It's not even credible to argue the validity of the actual words of the original Hebrew and Greek. After this is over, be patient. All right, so I believe we have a perfect Bible. Now I'm going to go to this one right here. There's historical evidence of a global flood. Nearly and every ancient culture had one, from the Toltec Indians to the Chinese to the Hawaiians and Babylonians. And there's even 9% of them, if you've studied the total collection, that say exactly 8 people were saved. There's no mistakes. There's no errors in the KJV. There's more evidence for Jesus Christ than there is of Plato or Julius Caesar or Omer. It has a 99% accuracy when you study all of the manuscripts. You put them together from different languages, and they all agree. I believe, I'm going to stop the screen share now. I believe that morals come from God, and that the specifics of those morals, like the 10 Commandments, they can be historically validated. So as a historical document, you could use that to show morals, or you could use some other religious text to show morals. Or I'm not sure how you could say that there were morals, there wasn't a God, because how then do you right or wrong if there's no God? It seems to me that the way to life in that situation would be to just do what feels right, because if no one's in control, then we must be the ones that decide what is right or wrong. So I'm going to end my opening statement there.
All right, and we have 6 minutes left, so we can put that into the discussion. And Mark, you have 10 minutes for your opener. And you're muted, actually.
Of course I am. Of course I am. It has to happen. Thank you so much. I'll just get my slideshow set up and share my second screen. And just tell me when I'm up and running.
Okay. Yep, you're all good.
Okay, good morning, evening, afternoon. My name is Mark Reid, and today I have the pleasure of taking the negative against the proposition, do moral absolutes exist? I would like to thank Debatecafe, my opponent, and of course the audience for their time while we discuss this subject. Now, firstly, what is morality? Morality is incredibly complex, one of the most complex things you're going to discuss. So I'll try and get through this pretty fast. These definitions were drawn from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but they're not alternative definitions. The first is used to refer to the morals of society in descriptive sense, like when you say this society has these morals. The second definition is what we should hold to, or what people ought to do in society, regardless of the descriptions of the morals that society actually has. The second definition, what we ought to do, is probably the crux of this debate. But it's interesting to note under absolutism, the specified conditions do not matter due to the nature of absolute morality. Absolutism is the ideology that moral absolutes exist, that moral truths are true regardless of any condition or context placed upon it. This is in addition to moral universalism, which states that morals hold true across any society or culture, but moral absolutes say inside those cultures and societies, there are moral truths that cannot be violated under any conditions. I'll give you an example. Can't believe the concept of lying is always absolutely immoral. Can't believe there was no circumstance or extenuating events that would render lying a moral action. In Kant's view, any lie told for any reason would still be immoral, regardless of the intention or the consequence of the lie. So the major problems with moral realism, or believing that moral truths are objective, is a vast difference of moral thought between the people who all claim to possess an objective moral standard. Even within a singular religion, and indeed even in a denomination down to individual members, moral diversity occurs. People think different things are moral. The difference may be slight, but it appears that people asserting moral universalism, or that morals apply everywhere, cannot agree on what those moral truths actually are. Since morals are drawn from the interpretation of a text or doctrine, the interpretation itself is, of course, subjective and therefore not objective. So while even if they could demonstrate an objective moral standard, which I might add no one has managed to do, they cannot seem to access this standard in a consistent manner. The other problem is proto-morality, which we find in animals and other social species. These behaviors, which seem to be a precursor to actual morality, seem to be common depending on how social and how intelligent the animals actually are. Science has been analyzing moral imperatives. It's found that mental state attribution, which is necessary input to social decision-making, relies on a network of interconnected cortical regions, i.e. parts of your brain. These regions supporting mental state attribution are coactivated, specifically coactivated during social decision-making processes, and have been mapped sort of as part of neural imaging work using an MRI machine to investigate the neural correlates between the neural activity and the decision being made. As stimuli, moral dilemmas or moral statements and pictures induce emotional reactions that are usually employed. A main difference between these stimuli is the perspective of the participants reflecting first-person moral dilemmas, or third-person perspective, which are moral reactions to some other moral decision. These emotions are tied to biological imperatives, all seen in social animals, and I'll discuss a couple. Empathy is the ability to understand and emulate the feelings of another. It's one of the foundational senses for social organisms to allow cooperative function of the societies. From empathy, we can form compassion for others, as we can sense how they feel and react accordingly. This mental state prevents intersocietal violence and fosters the care of weaker members of the society. This is invaluable for social species, as their strength relies on the individual contribution of every member to a group effort. To put it basically, have you ever watched a movie and felt sad for the characters? This is showing empathy. And I do want to point out that there has been a couple of, and I won't play the video, but there has been a couple of examples where gorillas have actively protected children falling in their enclosures and cared for them. Jambo the gorilla on the left actually prevented other gorillas from approaching the child and actively went out of his way to protect the child from any harm. Oops. I'm not going to play them. Okay, the other one is reciprocity. It's the sense of being given the same reward for the same action. And when that action is taken by one member to assist another, the same action is taken by another to assist the same member in the same circumstance. It's a give and take. This gives foundation to the sense of fairness and equity, that things ought to be reciprocated between members of society. To put this basically, that feeling of satisfaction when cake is distributed and shared equally is a feeling created by reciprocity. And again, I got another video. I probably won't have time to show it and try and keep with Christopher having a short intro, but basically they fed two monkeys treats. One got the better treat and one got the worst treat. The one that got the worst treat, after seeing the other monkey get the better treat, actually threw a temper tantrum and didn't want the treat anymore. It felt it unfair that somebody got paid better for the same work, and that's a fascinating experiment. So this observed behavior in monkeys shows a proto-morality. I'm not claiming that this is actually a true moral system. It's not codified. It's not implemented in a systematic way that we expect from moral systems, but it does show the development of moral systems as the precursor for morality. These monkeys, these white-faced capuchins, they bluff, they lie by faking an alarm call to sneak extra food. This behavior is seen as immoral in their society, and the monkey, if caught, may be punished by that society. It's seen in multiple different species, and it's a clear indicator for moral violation and punishment. This behavior is best explained by biological imperatives and mental states that have been generated by neurological function that has, I might add, been observed under scientific condition and mapped using an MRI machine. There's no reason to think these moral imperatives are the provenance of any deity or supernatural being when they are best explained by the behavioral systems and neurology of organisms. I will look forward to examining some of the moral precepts that my opponent claims are absolute and see if they indeed hold true under any circumstance. Thank you.
All right. And we're going to have 7-minute rebuttals. So, Chris, go ahead whenever you're ready. Oops.
Well, I think that right and wrong are political issues. You know, it's just there's problems created when those political offices, you know, they're instituted and then you get certain laws legislated. There's a problem holding it together if there's not an absolute standard to go by, because they know that their laws are just, they're human laws, and we're subject to error and flaws, and we make emotional decisions, and all that comes into play with legislating certain things. What is right and what is wrong, but people get confused. There's a lot more susceptibility to confusion in that political realm if they don't have a standard, if they can't say, here is what we know to be right and wrong, and then here's our law, here's how we're going to try to meet that standard. But if you don't have that standard, then that human, that's subject to all those flaws and stuff, that human being is going to be left with the idea that he must be the absolute standard, like the government tells you what is right and wrong. And I think that's dangerous. It's more beneficial that our moral standards come from God, because people that believe that their rights come from God do not make good slaves. And that is a good, it's a good thing for people to have, to not be scared of what man can say. As long as they have they know what is right and wrong, then they know what they're supposed to be fighting for, and what kind of, if they're in a certain political party, why they should vote for certain laws to be legislated, because they have a standard. Or if you don't have that standard, I think it opens up society to things like communism and dictators and tyranny, because they believe that they are right and nobody can tell them otherwise. Because you can't say that they're wrong if there's no God, if there's no absolute standard. So they get to decide what is right and wrong for everybody, and that's not a place that I want to live. So I'll just go through some of these things that I've wrote down. I'd like to hear like a response from that, but we can, I'll just finish out the rebuttal session here. But that's my first point, that it's a political issue, but I don't think the politics can hold together if there's not an absolute standard. I think it would fall apart into something chaotic, like communist China, for instance. But people have a conscience and animals do not have a conscience. That is something that actually separates us from the animal, even though we know that, things like monkeys, they will feel emotions, human emotions of injustice, and gorillas, they killed a child. But in other circumstances, that child is going to die. If he comes to the monkey at the wrong time of the day, like it's just an animal. It doesn't know why it's even feeling that way. There's these human emotions of injustice and stuff that's in animals could be a way that, it's that's how they survive. That's just what that particular animal looks like. That's how they live. And they do reflect human emotions, but those are not going to like put a boundary on things that they're willing or not willing to do for basic survival. Like they will do terrible things. They don't have like a standard, they don't have laws or anything. They don't have language. So it's just an instinct. It's not anything that they're doing of their own free will. It's actually instinctively in them. And it's because they were created, but we won't get into that. How much time do I have, Snake?
3 minutes.
All right. Without empathy, I believe that society would be very cruel. So Mark spoke of empathy, and that's something that we naturally feel. But if you were able to somehow explain how, something that most people would consider to be cruel, if you were to be able to explain them, just use like forms of intelligence to make arguments and say it's actually not cruel, like to kill this person. Like, for instance, Hitler was trying to exterminate Jews and make it legal. He actually did make it legal for anybody to kill a Jew because they thought that they were inferior species. So it's technically okay to kill them. They're not a human, they're an animal. But I think that's cruel if you want an empathetic and a sympathetic, society. If you want, merciful rulers and governors over your city, they need a moral standard, because if they don't, it's more likely that they will develop into somebody who thinks that they just get to decide what is right or wrong. And, how can you really define what is cruel unless you have an absolute standard? So it's very dangerous territory to not have an absolute standard. I think that a random collection of chemicals, if that's how we came about, I don't see how you could even trust your own thoughts if that's all that you are and that's all that morals and ethics is. Just a random collection of chemicals and, synapses firing, and that's all that are emotions, and that's all that ethics is. I think that it's questionable. I don't think that you could trust something like that. If your brain is a collection of random chemicals that got together by chance over millions of years, you shouldn't even trust your own thoughts. That's the end of my rebuttal. Thank you.
All right, so about a little over 1 minute to spare. And we'll just put that into the discussion time. And Mark, your rebuttal begins whenever you start talking.
Thank you so much, Snake. And it's a bit early for Godwin's law, but sure, let's go. So the basically, Chris said the word comes from the Lord. We need verification of this. It all is depending on interpretation as well. He hasn't actually shown that, merely asserted it. He says that it's historical. The Bible's historical. And I do admit there's some historical things there, but there's no historicity for God. There's only claims of a God and a God-like being and events that happen. There's no history behind supernatural things. It claims to be preserved by God, and he even used the word that the Bible claims to be preserved by God. He used that word specifically. And yes, it is a claim, but an unsubstantiated one at that. And you've got to find a way to substantiate that claim before you can even say that the word was delivered by a God. People were put to death for translation. I mean, basically, and I want to ask in the open discussion, is it moral to translate something? I would say yes, it's very helpful for society. I don't know why he's bringing up that people were put to death for translation. It's very strange, because it sort of suggests that maybe that was moral in the past, but not moral now. I don't know what the position on that is. The text hasn't changed, and you said that 99% are the same, but the problem is that you still don't have the originals. So things could have changed since the originals, because we don't have the originals of the Bible. And that has been admitted by every single biblical scholar out there. There are some things in the Bible, like in the end of Mark with the handling poisonous snakes and talking in tongues, that was added later. And we know it was added later because the earlier versions didn't have those things in it. So it is possible that there is things in the Bible that were not in the originals. And unfortunately, Christopher can't show that the originals are the same, because he just doesn't have them. It's a perfect Bible. I don't know how we demonstrate this, that it is perfect. I see a lot of imperfections in it. I see a lot of vastly immoral things and terrible things in it. One of them he mentioned, which is people would make bad slaves. And yeah, slavery is in the Bible. He claimed that about the flood. It's not a flood debate, but I will mention that China, the Jotun people, I believe, and China, but definitely Japan, did not experience a global flood. They have no records of it. Their civilizations continued largely undisturbed through the time period you're talking about. There's nothing to back up a global flood. So yeah, and again, the 99% accuracy that you mentioned, it's still, we don't know if it's the same as the originals. And from what we know, it was sort of based upon oral tradition that was written down. So we don't know the exact word, and it still is up to interpretation and people translating it and copying it correctly. So there's a whole lot of errors that can go into it. And he mentioned the 10 commandments, they're morals from God. I want to know whether the other commandments are in there, because it's not just 10. There are a number of commandments in the Bible. I wonder if he would stand by those proclamations as well as the 10 commandments. But that's basically my rebuttal. But I'll just add that nowhere in here did sort of Chris address a absolute morals that hold true over any circumstance. I'm not sure if he's going to address that at all, and perhaps provide us with some moral absolute precepts that will hold true over any circumstance. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
All right, we got an extra 3 minutes. So we have up to 53 minutes available for discussion time if you guys want to go the whole 53.
Yeah, sure. You can start, Christopher, because I just spoke. So where do you want to start off?
Well, you said that there was no history of this, no documented, verifiable history of supernatural events, right?
Yes.
You don't believe that?
No, I don't. I think that there's history, as in, a number of cities were mentioned. It may well be true that there are a number of individuals there that were, historical figures. Say Paul, for instance, is under no doubt. I'd even believe that Jesus was a historical figure, but there is no actual documented evidence for any of the supernatural events. There's just claims in a book.
It's not just a book, though. It's a historical document.
Do you think other religious texts are historical documents? What about
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you think that Muhammad flew to the moon and cut the moon in half?
Nope, that's not verifiable. See, there's a difference between a historical document and a verifiable one. Like the things that it says happened actually happened.
So how are you verifying these supernatural events?
There's a number of ways you could verify it, but I guess the resurrection of Jesus Christ would be the best example.
So how do you verify that?
From the dead.
How do you verify that?
Well, you look at each of the gospel accounts, each of the writers. They gave an account of the life of Jesus, his death, his resurrection, and it's verifiable. The things that they're saying happened, they match with each other. They don't match too closely either. You know, one writer can actually give details where the other writer didn't give. So this is like, you know, if you're looking at, you know, somebody's writing about somebody who lived and somebody who died, and they tell one story, and then you look at another person, they tell another story, and then you go back to the original writings and you find out that these are almost like not even 200 years after the actual event happened. Like, people were talking about these writings have been around since like 200 AD, and they match with each other. If you compare, you know, Bibles from other languages and other translations, even, these things that are happening all match up. So why would all of those stories align? And things like the global flood that you can verify with like geology, why would those things not be true if it's verifiable? You know, if you can tell that certain things happen. The resurrection, that'd be one example, just looking, and then you could use what about the global flood, which obviously you disagree with, but there are things.
So you're going through a lot there, Christopher. I'm just gonna cut in because you're going through a lot of things there. So people sort of said these things in those documents, and like I said, it came from an oral history that was sort of, you don't have the originals, you don't know who wrote them even. But traditionally they're associated with the disciples, but that's not necessarily the case. We don't know for sure. Most of them never refer to themselves by name, except, you know, maybe Paul. People wrote about Muhammad too. That's the thing. Like, people wrote about this guy as well. There's no reason why the Bible gets special privilege for saying, hey, people wrote about it, therefore it's true. You haven't actually verified it. What you've got is a series of associated books by people that all knew each other, or presumably knew each other, or it could have been different people, same person. There's a lot of different questions here about where they came from, and you don't know, because you don't even know for sure who wrote most of those books. The whole idea that geology backs up the flood is ludicrous. Mainstream geology absolutely refutes flood geology. It's been thrown out the window and does not support it in any way, shape, or form. Stratigraphy itself overrides the flood, but this isn't a flood debate. This is about morality. So it's kind of strange that you're delving into.
Well, the flood is a supernatural event, right?
I don't know. I don't think the flood happened at all, and geology backs up that the flood didn't happen at all.
Mark, if the flood did, hypothetically,
but it didn't.
Wouldn't it be supernatural? Wouldn't it have to be?
If the flood happened hypothetically, would it be supernatural? I don't even know how to answer that. Because here's the reason why. It's because theists claim that God does all kinds of natural events, and we don't call them supernatural. They're just natural events. So if there is a flood in Indonesia, if God designated that to happen, it's a perfectly natural event. So it depends on who I'm talking to that says, hey, it's supernatural, or it's a natural event that God just decided would happen. But I want to get back to the morality question, because that is the question here on absolute morality. And I was sort of talking about what are some of the precepts that would hold absolute under any circumstances? What would be the moral facts that you're claiming exist that would be absolute? Like, there would be no exceptions to that.
Any of the civil laws in the Old Testament are absolutely true.
So thou shalt not kill.
By the government.
So thou shalt not kill.
Right. Well, murder, technically.
Thou shalt not murder. Okay.
Right.
So what if you're under the heel of a brutal totalitarian government? Because murder is a legal term, right? Mm-hmm. What if you're under the heel of a total totalitarian government? The people are oppressed and being killed. Is it okay to rebel and murder in that case?
Nope. Can't do it.
No, so you've just got to suffer under a brutal totalitarian dictator who's killing your family.
Yeah, I don't believe that that we should have fought against the British and established the United States. That's
right. So you should have just languished under British rule, paying their taxes and supporting their kings forever, basically. That would have been.
there's other ways to go about overturning a government. You don't necessarily have to use violence. Maybe they could have done something else.
That's true. That's true. But sometimes there isn't. There just isn't. And
Yeah.
So thou shalt not bear false witness, for instance. So you don't believe that people should be able to lie under any circumstance.
No.
Okay. So what if you're a person who sort of you're in World War II, you've got a Jewish family hiding with you, a Nazi comes to the door and says, is there anybody else in the house? And you know that if you tell the truth, not only you and your family will be killed, but the Jewish person and their family will be killed. Is it okay to lie? Is it moral to lie in that case?
Is survival to lie in that case? I would say that it's not right, but God, seeing the situation, would probably forgive it. There's examples in the Old Testament of people lying to save their lives, like Abraham and his son Isaac did the same thing. Lied about their, what is it?
This isn't about what God forgives. This is about what we ought to do in a situation. So moral absolutes are sort of, there is no exception. They absolutely hold for all situations. So as I gave the example, Immanuel Kant would say that it is always immoral to lie, even in that situation. So really, I'm trying to get from you, what ought you do in that situation? If you're saying that you ought to lie and then let God forgive you, that the ought is the morality that we're talking about here. So it would be moral to lie and then seek forgiveness.
That's where empathy comes in. You know, you got to kind of be empathetic. What are you going to do in that situation? It's obviously wrong, but is God going to be a good God if he doesn't forgive you for doing that? That wouldn't be very nice of him. You know, what can you do?
I mean, I don't know what God would do, but I would agree that you ought to lie in that situation, that you ought to say, hey, this person's doing something really wrong. And because of this specific situation and context, I ought to lie to get the best outcome that I can, and the most beneficial outcome that I can. I think that's perfectly reasonable. But that would be a case of moral relativism, where you're basically saying, hey, because of the relative situation, the morals change. That on the whole...
No, I'm not saying that they would change. I'm just saying that it's going to be wrong either way if you do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll see any repercussions, though, because of the fact that it's wrong.
Well, I mean, we're not kind of talking about repercussions, but talking about what you ought to do, which is morality. What is the right thing to do in that circumstance? What is the good thing to do in that circumstance?
I don't think that there is one, honestly.
You don't think there
is?
Do you think there's one that is better than another, so more good than another?
Yep. But it's still bad to lie, like you said.
Sure. But when you're talking about morality, you're talking about what we ought to do. So if one option is less bad than another, that is probably what we ought to do in that situation. And that's really my point.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, that's just one example, but what about, say, the prescription to have no other God but me? Sort of, so the prescription against religion. So you would think that it is moral to ban all other religions?
Yep. Yeah, I want them all gone. That's what I would say. Get rid of all of them.
Okay. So what do you think the consequence of that would be in practicality in our current civilization?
Well, you can't legislate it is the problem. So in the Old Testament, the only thing that you could legislate is you put somebody to death if they know that you are, I mean, everybody there is supposed to be following the Lord, but if you have some kind of an altar at your house or whatever, and you try to go persuade someone to go and worship at that altar, then you could die. But otherwise, if you're just worshiping the altar at home and you're not compelling anybody, then you're just fine. So there is a certain level of freedom of speech in the Old Testament, but you can't go as far as to try to persuade someone to join that false religion. But there's nothing you can do about them living in society.
Well, I think you could legislate it, but it would be sort of a brutal totalitarian dictatorship or theocracy, basically something akin to the Middle Eastern theocracies kind of thing. I think you'd find something like that would legislate it. So I think it's possible. I just don't think it's moral to do so. I don't think that's a moral commandment at all to sort of prohibit people from believing what they want to believe. I also want to talk to you about the and you brought up a good point, killing people for violating these moral precepts. Do you support that kind of, that should be the punishment as the Bible outlines?
Yeah, it should be like, if I don't know, if I was to petition for this kind of a law, I would say that you should be allowed to worship idols at your house or believe in any religion, but it should not be legal for you to try to persuade somebody away from Christianity.
It should not be, or it should be illegal. Sorry, I missed that.
It should be illegal for you to try.
It should be illegal. And so do you support the pronouncement of the punishment by the Bible, the death, or I believe it's stoning is the punishment? Yes. Death, right.
Death.
Right. So, right. Okay. So I presume that you would support some of the other sort of decrees through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, sort of, men sleeping with other men kind of thing, and that kind of, you would promote death for that as well.
I'm a KJV only Baptist, so you can take a guess.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't like to guess. I think that death would be okay. So the reason why I think that that's highly immoral is because myself, I am a meta-ethical relativist, which means that the goal of societies can change. So I personally think that I would like to see a society and individuals with a lot of well-being. That is my utility. I would like to see people that are well and healthy, both mentally and physically. So well-being would be the metric I would strive for. So I would consider that highly immoral because it does not promote well-being of the society or well-being of an individual. The whole idea that you can put somebody to death for their sexual what attracts them is so sort of repugnant to me that it defies description. I would like to know, how do you think a society would look like if people were being put to death for simply their sexual preference?
I don't want to get this channel striked, so I don't even know if I should even give an answer.
All right, but we can change the subject if you want.
Just be honest. We don't want to, unless something is specifically like not allowed to be said, like a certain word. But other than that, we don't care about getting demonetized or anything like that. So
you're a brave soul, Snake. I love you. But yeah, I think that society would be great. That would be a simple answer to that. It would be a paradise to live in if you didn't have to worry about that.
So I would see it as a brutal totalitarian society with sort of people going around and finding people that are doing these particular things, like lying, for instance, or I believe one of the the sort of commandments in the Bible is if your young son is sort of drinking and lazy and stuff, you take him out to the tabernacle and stone him to death. I think that these kind of pronouncements would make a really horrible world. You would have people roaming around getting dragged away before the tabernacle and stoned to death with stones for simply being who they are or expressing who they are. It sounds like a dystopian nightmare to me.
Well, you really don't have a nation to compare it to. You got to look at it relatively speaking. Sure. If you see a nation that's doing everything that God says and see how things work out for them and compare that to one that doesn't, like America, it's going to be a huge difference in the amount of growth, the amount of economical success or what have you. It's just going to be, it's a no contest. People that obey God, a nation that fears the Lord, is going to thrive and succeed. And a nation that doesn't will eventually collapse.
Well, we can sort of do a base comparison. We can sort of evaluate the societies that have been before, that have been highly religious within the Christian society, especially when the Inquisitions got up and running during the Holy Roman Empire. And we can also compare that against modern theocracies where, for instance, in the Middle East, they generally cut off hands for stealing and things like that, which, you know, you've got to admit that the Bible has a much more stringent punishment for that. Its punishment is for stealing. What's the punishment?
It's not there. You paid double or triple one of those, whatever you stole. Now, if you cut somebody's hand off, yes, you do have to get your hand cut off. But there's nothing like that in the Bible to suggest that you would have to get your hand cut off or anything other than paying double or triple what you stole.
Okay. Because sort of Proverbs says, whoever steals a man and sells him, anyone found possession shall be put to death.
That's man stealing. That's
true. I do apologize. But there is a lot of stuff where death is the penalty kind of thing, including for sleeping with another man, being lazy, worshipping another god, things like that. I don't know how you're going to justify that as moral when you're out killing people for simply having different opinions than you.
Well, I mean, yeah, I just don't want to get into the sexual part of the Bible, because then that would require some hard truths that I could say. That's some words that are not.
There's plenty of other things that require death, right? There's plenty of other punishments that is death, correct?
Well, that's the hardest one to swallow, I think. The one that the gay rules, we'll call them. I think that's the hardest pill to swallow when it comes to like deciding whether or not some of the civil laws of the Old Testament are actually right to do, you know, because it seems like that one is not right. Like there's something wrong with that part of the Bible, but actually turns out to be quite true because they're dangerous people.
There's something wrong with that part of I thought you said that the Bible was infallible. How could that be?
It is. I'm just saying it seems to most people that that part of the Bible is wrong. Like if they were to look at any other part of the Bible, they'd be willing to agree with it. That just seems to be a boundary to a lot of people, which it's not. Well, if you look at it closely, you examine all the reasons behind those laws.
Well, I think that most people would also agree that stoning your son in front of, you know, in a public square for being lazy and drinking is probably not moral either. In fact, nearly every person would say that. I don't know of a single person that would stand by that, except.
Well, why would a young teenager be drinking alcohol? That seems crazy in the first place for that to be happening.
Why is that crazy? Why?
That is not good because that's what God says. You don't do that. You don't drink alcohol as a little kid. You're not even really supposed to drink it when you're old enough. So for a little kid to drink it, it's going to develop a lot of problems. Probably going to start being excessively vocal towards their parents. And when you have an out of control kid that cannot be fixed, that's what the Bible commands. But that's an excessive situations, probably never even happened. They probably never even executed that law. It would be good to correct the kids, though.
How do you know?
Advantage.
How do you know that law was never executed? It was written down and prescribed. Yeah. How do you know it was never executed?
I don't know. I'm just assuming it probably wasn't.
You're just assuming it wasn't. So it was a law written down, codified in the Old Testament, placed in your infallible text, but you're sort of assuming that law was never broken by any rebellious teenager or lazy teenager or drunken teenager.
No, it probably was. It was too hard, you know. Who wants to put their kid to death? That would be a hard thing to do. So I'm just saying they probably, just because of the severity of it, just because the high emotions of doing something like that, they probably didn't have the guts to even go forth with that. I mean, they weren't even keeping the Sabbath half the time. So why would you assume they would enforce such a law?
Yeah, I think that that's irrelevant to the point, and I think that you're entirely lacking credibility. You don't have any evidence that they didn't enforce the law, but you're actually saying that this is the biblical law that you support. So it's irrelevant whether they did it or not because you're standing by it. I do understand that some of the audience are getting unsettled with some of the things you've been saying, so maybe we should pivot off, Snake, if you do want to. And I do realize that we've been sort of sorry.
It's up to you guys. I don't want to censor anyone. I do know that these are sensitive topics, so maybe a warning is in order.
Okay.
But I
And
don't
that's
want
okay.
to censor.
I'm happy with going to other topics. That's fine. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about sort of your standard of morality, and I think that I'm a bit flabbergasted. But so you had a question about why people take care of their family and things like that, and sort of so in neuroscience, there's something called kin-associated compassion. What it means is that you're sort of biologically wired to feel more compassion towards those closer in your kin and less towards those further away. So things like the Jews, for instance, because they are further away and they were othered by the Germans, they're basically seen as you are not part of us, you are on the outside. Neuroscience explains perfectly how that can occur when your sense of compassion is wired to feel more compassionate about those you see as part of your group or your kin, as opposed to people outside of it. So maybe you'd like to talk a bit about why Hitler was a Catholic and still did that kind of thing. How those which I consider incredibly immoral what he did. Why the moral diversity is there? Why people who are religious believe they can do these immoral things?
I'm not sure. I know that the natural, affection that we feel like towards people that are closer to us, that would be a product of design. There's more accountability for people that are actually a part of your family than you would have for someone that's not. So I think we're genetically wired to be closer, emotionally, so that we will have more of a sense of protection, because you're not responsible for people who aren't in your family. It's just simple as that. So I don't know. But there was kind of a second half to that question, which I don't think I fully comprehend.
I'll bring it up again, but it's sort of as part of that, you sort of said, well, you've got a genetic sort of connection to those closer to you. I would totally agree. That's the basis for kin-associated compassion. But you sort of said design, and I don't think this was designed. And it brings up that you sort of kept saying chance, and your brain developed by chance, and these things by chance. And it's really wrong to say that, because it wasn't chance that led us to have these brains and social animals to cooperatively engage each other. The fact that it is a social animal survival mechanism, that we use community and social interactions to provide us with a network to survive. Like a human by themselves in the wilderness is incredibly vulnerable. They're almost dead in the water. But as a cooperative species, we're incredibly powerful, and that isn't chance that led us to there. And I just wanted to sort of address that.
No, it is chance that led to it. Because
what do you mean by
if
chance?
you're going to create the human mind or any mind of any animal by random mutations, a mutation is an error. So it has to accidentally produce something that is beneficial. That is random. Even though the process may not necessarily be random, the product of the process is totally blind.
Okay, so it's like, so if you roll dice, right, you just roll dice and they get random results, and you pick off, just say you roll 50 dice and you pick off the 25 lowest kind of thing, right? It's not chance that says that the result will be high, right? It's not chance that says, hey, you're going to get a higher number than if you just pulled out dice at random. It's selection. It's eliminating that which is lower produces a higher result, and that's not chance. It's called determinism. It's deterministic.
Well, it's really like an example of, I'd hate to get off on a creation debate here, but that's more of an example of like nature being super cold, and then it kills off all of the animals that have too short of hair. But that process is totally random, though. Why did it get cold? Was that like something the atmosphere had a brain of its own to make it cold and kill off all the short-haired animals so that only the ones with long hair could survive? That process is totally random, and that's what I'm referring to. Not the genetic process of producing, like selecting certain information, scrambling it, and making something else.
Yeah, no, it's not random. It's because the mutations arise randomly, but the ones that are selected are the ones that do have longer hair or thicker fur or whatever that is that survives in the environment. And that's deterministic, because even though these things are cropping up randomly, the process determines who will survive and who won't survive. And there is some randomness in it. I will admit that. Genetic drift sort of says that randomly some will survive, but mostly it is natural selection. So when you think about selection, think about selecting the lowest dice, for instance. The dice roll was random, but the way you selected those dice out to eliminate the lowest ones is not random. You are doing selection.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not random. And the fact that we arrived with these or sort of evolved these brains isn't random either. The best weapon we have had against predators, against weather events, against everything has been our social cooperation and communication skills. So our ability to work together productively has been our greatest survival mechanism. And I don't think there's anybody that's going to challenge that today. It's always been the case that humans working cooperatively are the strongest.
I don't know what to say about that. That's not random, because to me, oh my God, I don't know if I can address. How is it not random? If we start out as a primitive cell, and then it grows into a whale over 2 billion years, I'm not sure how that could happen. It's not like there's some kind of a nervous system operating that process. It's just things are falling into place in the right order, but it really is happening randomly. It's
right. So there's going to be organisms that arrive, and sort of 99% of organisms have gone extinct over that time, over the billions of years that organisms have been around. That organisms will arrive that do not have that luxury of having the right sort of combination kind of thing, and they will die. They will just.
Is there a reason though that it has happened this way? Is there a mind behind these biological processes? And if there is, that seems to be the moral standard there. Whatever.
Well, I mean, I say no, but not to my knowledge. Evolution doesn't preclude a god starting the process in some way, but it is just a case of mutations arising, and the ones with the mutations that aren't very good get eliminated, and the ones with good mutations just survive, and that's it. That's the entire process. But we are getting into a creationist evolution debate, I must admit. But the whole point that I'm trying to make is that when you consider from an evolutionary standpoint, the whole idea that we sort of have to cooperate in a society in order to advance and preserve our society isn't one that is sort of a random circumstance. If people don't work together, we don't survive. That's the problem. We have to kind of work together in a society and do things in a society in order to preserve that society, because that's the only way that a social species functions. So this neurology that we have, and that sort of we've been managed to, and maybe you want to speak on it, why we've been able to map neurological impulses in a MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging machine, and to the brain, and these feelings arising of empathy and reciprocity, and we can map all kinds of things. We can map anger, we can map all kinds of things. Why they exist in the brain, and why they aren't the cause for these emotional mind states that we have, that give rise to feelings of what we ought to and ought not to do?
Yeah, I think that those are totally natural feeling. Like it's
Sure.
just a process of biology and the nervous system and the it's basically electrical connections making all of these emotions. You got different hormones and they operate. So what I'm suggesting is that that is a created machine there. There is a reason why we feel there's a reason why those certain synapses are firing. There's a reason certain parts of the brain were made so that we could make so it is a natural process. It is coming from the natural wiring of the brain, like just emotions and hormones. All that's natural, nothing supernatural about it. But what is supernatural is the entire machine, the entire factory of the human body, and all of that works together. It was created, and so those feelings come from a moral absolute, a designer, and he has set forth certain laws, like thou shalt not. And I believe you probably don't like some of those laws, and that's why you reject him. But that's just my personal opinion. No offense, Mark Reid. I appreciate
I'd take none. No worries at all. So if the brain is this created machine by God that we feel empathy, I'm just going to sort of pick on empathy for the moment, and then sort of these laws were passed down, why does it violate our sense of empathy to do these things to people, like stoning them to death for minor transgressions, or sort of their for being rebellious as a child? Why do we feel that violates our sense of empathy? Why do I feel like that is a horrible thing to do? Because as empathy, sort of, you relate it to yourself and how you would feel in that circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody was stoning me to death, I would be horrified, scared, panicked. I can imagine how I would feel. So why is my sense of empathy that's been given by God violated by the laws that you claim God set down?
Because it's natural for you not to want to hurt somebody.
Right.
And now people that do hurt other people unlawfully, it's like you take somebody's life that wasn't yours. The only way out of that, to provide safety for everybody around them, is to kill that person. The only way to be just to everybody, is to make sure that that person isn't allowed to live anymore because he took a life that wasn't his. So the same thing happens. It's fair. That it feels like it's violating your natural sense of ethics just because you're hurting somebody, and that's what you're feeling. It's not that you're feeling that it's wrong necessarily. It just hurts you to see somebody hurt, and that's natural. And God doesn't like it either. That's why he thinks that certain people should be stoned, because he has a jealousy there. He saw one of his children get hurt. They didn't deserve to get hurt, and somebody has to pay that price. It's just, you do right and you get rewarded. You do wrong, you get punished.
Yeah, and I could sort of imagine somebody who participates in that, sort of having something like post-traumatic stress disorder. They regret what they have done because they have violated their sense of empathy, and feel for that person in front of them, especially if that person is a young man who probably didn't know any better and sort of was stoned to death for their transgressions. So what I don't understand, I'll sort of rephrase it maybe, is why not design a brain that when these laws are broken, you do not have that sense of empathy. Like, you can say, okay, I don't really care because the laws have been broken, but your mind doesn't do that. You have to overcome your sense of empathy in order to carry out something like that. That's why, that, for instance, if you don't know, that's why in a firing squad they use a squad and not just one person. Do you know why that is?
Mm-mm.
Okay, it's because when you're in a squad of like 10 people, you don't know who's shot the person, right? You all fire and he falls limp. You don't know if you did it or not. It provides that out where you can say, well, I probably missed, and so I didn't kill that person, was probably one of the other guys, kind of thing. And all of them are saying that, and that's why they use a firing squad instead of just having one person shoot the guy. There's a very good reason for that, and it's because they found that even though the law says they should do that it still affects the soldier. It's it affects their sense of empathy because they are a soldier too, and they could be in that position. Right. So why not design a brain that says, hey, when it's a clear-cut case of violating my laws, God's laws, empathy will just switch off and you just don't feel that anymore. Why does it still hold under these circumstances?
I think that's because there is a conflict of the human body to do what is right and to do what is wrong. So because of that conflict there, I don't think that kind of a neurological process would work. And just because there's already a situation in your biology, whatever that is, like where you know that something is right, like or something's wrong, for like stealing. You know that it's wrong, but you want to do it, So it's like, what do you do there? If somebody is being stoned and you feel bad for that person, is that the good side of you feeling bad for that person or the bad side? Because it could be the bad side. You may have not just looked over the situation. You may not feel so bad about that person being stoned had you known what they did.
I don't know. I mean, that's a hard situation to answer. I don't think I would ever feel good about stoning someone for instance, simply being drunk and lazy as a young man. I don't think I would ever feel good about that. I think that people are sort of convinced by certain doctrines that it's necessary. It's a necessary evil, but it's an evil nonetheless, because we've got to separate law from morality here. Because there's a lot of things in law that could be considered immoral, that could be considered things you ought not to do. And there's a lot of things that are immoral that just aren't in law. Like, for instance, I could go and yell at somebody on the street and call them all kinds of names. It may not be against the law, but it certainly is immoral. It's not the right thing to do. So I think we've got to separate these two out a bit, because you're sort of mixing them together, kind of thing. So the whole point is, if and you sort of said what is a conflict between the human body of what is right and what is wrong, but this stoning to death of people, you've said, is the right thing to do. It is right to do so. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why there's a conflict at all in the human body of what is right and what is wrong, if it is in fact the right thing to do.
That may be a question to ask the master engineer who constructed the human brain. Maybe not for me, because I don't know a lot about it.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I can't. I can't ask the master engineer, because they don't seem to make themselves available for. I mean, if you want to put him in the debate instead, I'm more than happy. But I can't seem to act. All I've got is you, Christopher. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry too. I really am.
No, that's okay. That's all right. So
if I could conjure Jesus into this debate, I certainly would.
Oh, but please do so. Yeah, so I think from my point of view that you have these emotions like empathy and reciprocity, and a sense of fairness arising from that, and a sense of compassion arising from empathy. I think that sort of with your saying, well, right and wrong is sort of balanced inside of you, and I don't disagree with that at all. I just don't know why, if morality comes from a God who says it's right to do this, why his designed sense of empathy would conflict with that. I think a much better explanation for that is that we have developed these senses of empathy and reciprocity, and that they are essential for social animals to survive together, and that it is incredibly immoral to do some of the things that you're describing in the Bible. Incredibly immoral. But one of the things that it sort of brings up in Numbers, I believe it's 31, they sort of say to slaughter an entire tribe, kind of thing. Which goes against your 10 commandments, thou shalt not murder, unless it's not murder because God commands it. But it's kind of, I consider it to be incredibly immoral. And I don't know whether, you feel a sense of empathy towards those people at all, or whether, that just is moral because God says it's moral.
I mean, free will has a lot to do with it, I would think, because initially you're designed to just love and care, and there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with your brain if you're created, like if you're Adam, the first man, for instance. Nothing is wrong until something goes wrong in that. And whatever that process, look, the Bible calls it the knowledge of good and evil. They suddenly had the intelligence to be able to do things like lie. And before they didn't have that. So when you introduce that knowledge, I think that it kind of corrupts the entire system. So that could be an explanation somehow as to your, like, why you would feel bad when somebody's getting stoned, even though God says that it's wrong. It would be natural to just be okay with it if you didn't have, you know, the knowledge of evil present to cause problems in the machine that you are. Trying to answer that the best that I can. I don't know.
No. I appreciate it. And I've got a couple of problems with that. That the whole point of Numbers 31 is God commanded them to do it. So I'm not sure how free will would play into that, because if God commands something, you know, how do you disobey that with free will? I mean, you can, but won't you be punished horribly? And isn't it immoral to do so if it is God that's commanding it? That would be my question for that one.
I'm not sure. I don't know, Mark. I don't know that one.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I'm not sure how that would work. What was the other part of your thing about? The tree of good and evil, right? So if you've got no knowledge of evil, but I don't understand how that relates, because if you've got knowledge of good and evil and that's causing the problem, isn't it that stoning is the evil that you're sort of pushing back against, that your emotive forces are sort of saying, hey, I don't want to do this?
That's what I'm saying. So if you look at somebody that's, you know, they're getting stoned for something that they're actually worthy of dying for, then if you feel bad about it, that could be a bad emotion. You may not want to feel that emotion, you know, so it could be a something sinful, you know, that's even causing that emotion. There's something wrong with the system in general. There's something wrong with creation. We're not even supposed to be living in a world like this. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. So,
well, I don't think the emotion is specifically due to everything around you. I think it's directed at you not wanting to take an action, that your sense of empathy sort of screams at you that it's wrong, and you have to overcome that reluctance, because it is what empathy says. Hey, this is horrible to me, because that's what the neural impulse puts your mind state in. And as I said, that's been documented, but you've sort of said, well, because you've got this knowledge of good and evil, if you didn't have a knowledge of good and evil, you just wouldn't care. My point is that a knowledge of good and evil only would say, okay, that act of stoning is evil, and that's why I don't like it. If it was a knowledge that it is good, then you would be happy to do so. But that's not the case.
You know, the Bible says that when God had to flood the world, it grieved him at his heart. And so he didn't want to do, even though it was right to do, he still didn't want to do it. He actually felt bad about it because he's hurting his creation. He doesn't want to hurt his creation, but it must be done to save his creation. So it's a conflict there.
Well, I mean, I see what you're saying. I just, you know, if you're designing something, I suppose if you want something to have complete free will in what they do based upon what God commands, like the commandments of God, you would probably not put in a inbuilt reluctance to do God's command because you see it as offensive or not palatable kind of thing. It seems weird to me. I do have another question though. Are things, and this will go back to a part of the references that I sent you, are these things moral because God commands them and approves of them, or are they immoral for some other reason and God is just relaying them to us?
I think something would be right or wrong, number one, because God said that it was right or wrong. And number two, because there's certain things we naturally feel are right or wrong, and that is a process of God designing us in a way that would perform his law, that we would naturally feel that his law is the right thing to do. So we're just, it's the way that we're created.
Well, which one would take precedent if you had two conflicting emotions? God commanded one thing and said it was right, but your body says, "Hey, this is wrong." Which one would you listen to? Which one ought you listen to?
Well, you have to have, the Bible. You have to have these writings to differentiate between what your heart feels and what is right or wrong. It even says in Proverbs in a certain place that there is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof is death.
Okay, so it's sort of subjective on what God wants as a priority, sort of. So if God decided that he's going to kill half the world's population at a snap of his fingers and make everybody, half the population of everything vanish, that would be a moral thing to do in your view.
Depends on what they did, what they were guilty of.
Depends on what they did.
Yeah, if he's going to kill somebody, you just got to find out what they were doing to be worthy of death.
Okay, so if God just wanted to kill half the population for no reason than to teach us a lesson, no reason whatsoever, just half the population, the snap of his fingers, that wouldn't be a moral thing to do because they hadn't done anything?
Yeah, that's correct. That would be not good for God to do that.
It would be not good for God. So God isn't the arbiter of what is moral and not moral. So it's not his decision what is moral and what is not moral.
No, it is his decision.
It's his decision.
I'm not sure what you're getting at here.
Well, I mean, if it is simply up to God to command what is good and evil, then technically any action he commands that is good or evil has to be by definition. That if God wanted to, he could snap his fingers and wipe out half the population at random. And that would
be wrong for him to do, though. And there's no story, nothing in the Bible that suggests he would or ever he's done that or would ever do that.
Well, the problem with that is that you've now sort of said that God doesn't decide what is good and evil, because if he can't determine that is good, then he isn't deciding what is good. So if he decides, hey, I want to do this and it is good for me to do this, and you say, hey, that's not good, then you are taking your morals from some other source.
No, I'm saying God doesn't do things that are against his own nature. He wasn't a created being in the first place. So once if he says that something is right or wrong, he will not do the opposite of that. He's incapable of lying, for instance. There are things that God cannot do. He has limits.
Okay, but so you said that God can't do things against his nature. Does his nature ever change?
No.
No. So everything in the Old Testament should still hold true today.
Yes.
Everything.
Not in the sense that you should still do certain things that are in the Old Testament, but in the sense that they actually happened. That would be if God says in the Old Testament you're not supposed to eat pork, then he changes that law in the New Testament. For the people in the Old Testament, that was still a good law. There's nothing wrong with that law, and nothing changed except the fact that you don't have to keep it anymore. If there's a change in the law, that doesn't. So the point of that is that it's not naturally sinful to eat like an unclean animal that's in the Old Testament. It was only a temporary law for those people, which is no longer necessary. So in a situation like that, God does change, but if it was originally meant to be just a temporary law, then he's not changing at all. It was always a part of his plan to remove the dietary and the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament and switch over to the New Testament where certain things are no longer necessary to do.
So God's nature can change
In the right context, yes.
in the right context. Okay, so why would we think that God wouldn't change to wiping out 50% of the population at random when at one point he did drown everybody? Why would we say his nature cannot change if that is up to him and he can, in fact, change his nature?
One more time. I'm trying to follow.
Yeah. I mean, you first said that God doesn't change his nature, but obviously if the morals change and the morals are according to his nature, then the nature must have changed. I think we understand that. So if God decides to change his nature to, I want to wipe out half the population with a snap of my fingers, why is that impossible to do? Because he has done genocide in the past, right? With the flood that you said happened. So as an internal critique, if he has destroyed 99% of the population and he's changed his nature, what stops him from changing his nature to a God that is moral to destroy 50% of the population with a snap of his fingers?
Well, there's nothing that says that part about him has changed. He doesn't kill people for no reason. He kills them when they're guilty of death, when they've killed other people, when they've done things that are worthy of death, horrible things that are listed in the law of Moses. So if he were to just snap his fingers and kill 50,000 people for no reason, that would go against his nature, and you would no longer be able to call him the God of the Bible, because that'd be contrary to the contents of the Bible, which are
1 minute left.
God does and does not do.
Yeah, but you've just said his nature can change. So the question was, what stops his nature from changing to a God that would do that?
What stops him from changing? Himself.
Yeah. Okay. But he has done that before, right? In the flood, he killed 99% of the people and left just Moses and Noah and his family alive.
Yeah, but they were worthy to die, all of those people.
Okay, so what if God's nature changes and he decides that we're worthy to die again? Why couldn't that happen?
Because you'd have to be able to identify something that we did, some crime that we committed.
And people aren't committing crimes by the Old Testament law right now? I mean, you just said that people that sleep with other men or, do all these things, they're worthy of death.
Okay, yeah, that's civil. So here in the Old Testament, you have civil laws, all right? You got dietary laws, things you're supposed to eat and not eat. You got ceremonial laws, the sacrifices. You got laws of holidays, certain holidays that you got to keep. So you got a calendar law, okay? Certain of those laws are no longer necessary, but every one of the civil laws, which has to do with people dying and living, every one of those is still necessary to keep. So, and there's nothing in the New Testament that indicates they have changed.
And that's time. I let you go a little bit over to finish your point, but it's all good. All right. So we're going to have 5-minute closings.
Beautiful.
And Chris, you're up first.
I believe the Bible is an ancient, documented record of events that actually happened. The evidence for Jesus Christ dwarfs any other figure of history. We don't have the originals, but we have very good evidence, for what we do have to be derived from the originals, if that makes any sense. I really couldn't spit that out well, but you wanted to know why I brought up the martyrs, and that's just to give a historical perspective of, what's happening with God's word as it moves through history, as people pass down these 66 books of the Bible. What is it changing? And the answer is no, it's not. It changes. It doesn't change. The Hebrew and the Greek text have always been there. The only way that they've changed is when people try to move them from the Hebrew over to the English or some other language. You're translating it incorrectly or correctly. That would be where that change is happening. But the actual ancient historical record has been documented, verified. It's that didn't change. No, the teachings, the words, they didn't change. Just the translation has changed. And people dying when they're trying to translate it from the Hebrew into the Greek into the common language. It's like illegal for them to do. So it's not like the Catholic Church has a monopoly over the scriptures and they're behind closed doors changing what was written. The whole reason that people would even believe it is because that it hasn't changed. So can't just deliberately change it and expect people to still respect it. I don't think that's reasonable. It wouldn't explain why we even have the Bible today, why it was preserved. It's preserved because it can be verified to be a historical document. It can be verified. No archaeological excavation ever has disproven the Bible. It's all, a lot of it has even been verified, like intentionally going out to find evidence for Sodom and Gomorrah, for the Exodus out of Egypt. Verified. The 10 Commandments. I don't even think you could find a culture that disagrees with any of those things. It's just we have a natural conscience that aligns with the Word of God, and that will be my closing statement.
Alrighty. And Mark's up next, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So this was a really fascinating debate. I think that between the two sort of proposed systems we have here, one has a whole load of things that most people would consider immoral, and that's not a coincidence. It's much more reasonable to think that a moral system arose in social animals from the neurological pathways we can actually demonstrate and observe, that give rise to empathy, which then leads to compassion, and gives rise to reciprocity, which leads to a sense of fairness. And there's certainly much better outcomes for a society instead of putting your sort of faith that this book is true when it doesn't really have any demonstrable evidence for it and doesn't really give you any sense of morality that you can follow. The world that Christopher described is one of killing people and sort of sentencing them to horrible death for minor transgressions like your sexuality or whether you are an unruly child that the parents don't want to deal with. These sort of really minor things that are just punishable by the worst punishment you could ever conceivably place upon somebody. It would be a frightening world if sort of Christian death squads roamed around trying to find the gay people to pick off. It would be a horrifying, terrible world. So these senses that we have are much more explained by neurological mental states rising from neurological drives. So this whole idea of kin-associated compassion, and my problem with Christianity is they essentially say that, or they other you into well, they're not of our tribe. And don't forget that God did sanction and indeed instructed the Israelites to kill the Midianites as part of his commandments. So as we heard, that isn't the right thing to do, but it's still the right thing to do because God, there's a lot of contradictory explanations here. And if God's nature changes, which we agreed on, and morals come from God's nature, it means that those morals can change, regardless of what the Bible says, because that's just one interpretation of what God's nature is, which he's already admitted can change depending on the context. And I really don't think any of the things that he brought up are moral absolutes. They're moral under any conditions. He even said that in the case of the Jewish person, you would probably lie. And I would put it to you that is the right thing to do. You ought to do that. That is the moral thing to do, as well as not kill people for their sexuality is the moral thing to do. It benefits society. It allows us to work together. It is a much better system than the one that Christopher is proposing, with death squads roaming the land for people committing transgressions. We can work cooperatively. We can discuss these morals. We can have a frame of reference in which we decide how we want our society to go. And let's face it, Christianity has always been lagging behind secular morality for ages. And it has nothing to say about the challenges that we're going to see in the future. It's got nothing to say about space travel or cloning or who gets what resources or any of these questions that we have coming up. But secular morality does. If you're interested in the well-being of people and the well-being of your society, then there will be objective things we can do to increase the well-being and harmoniousness of society. And unfortunately, implementing death squads isn't one of them. That is incredibly immoral, because if Christopher agrees that we ought to make society better, that that's the goal, then death squads is objectively immoral according to that goal. Thank you.
All right, and 1 minute to spare, so looking good. All right, and let's see where we have. I think 5 questions, and I'm going to do the scoring after the questions, audience questions, and but the audience questions do not reflect on the score, so just an FYI. And first question is from Titan Uranus. What if another religion also had a rule against proselytizing? Would you submit yourself for execution? And that's for Chris.
All right. Don't be afraid to talk down to me, but what does that word mean, proselytizing?
It's kind of
Preaching, essentially.
preaching,
Yeah.
and basically preaching, trying to spread your religion and
truth of your religion to people.
Yeah, if I was living in a nation that had, like if I was living in Islam and I was under strict Sharia law and you cannot persuade people to become anything other than a Muslim. You try to persuade somebody to be a Christian, you're worthy of death. So yeah, I would submit myself for execution. I would have to if I was living in that area.
Interesting. Any response, Mark?
Oh, it's just I'm not sure. That sounds like sort of moral relativism to me, that if you're living in another country, then their moral law is sort of you ought to follow their moral pronouncements. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
You have no choice.
All right. Your way or Yahweh. Okay, this is for me. I did actually get your email this time. I wasn't seeing it last time, but yeah, I've tracked you down. I have your email. I'll make sure to respond to that right after this. And Stupid Horror Energy asks, ask him. Okay, so this is probably for Chris, off topic, but if you wanted to answer. Ask Chris if he thinks all mutations are random. How does the human malaria-resistant hemoglobin S mutation originate in the gene and population where it is needed?
Human, so you're becoming resistant to malaria probably because you have sickle cell anemia that's enabling the certain cells in your body to resist malaria better than they would be if you didn't have sickle cell anemia. That's random, kind of in the same. It's the cells that are resisting the malaria already had the capability to resist malaria. There's a random selection going on where certain ones that don't have the ability to resist the malaria, they all die, and then the ones that do overtake that little population in the cells. And I think that the introduction of sickle cell anemia to make this process happen, that's a random process. It's not like there was a mind behind any of it. There was a mind behind producing the cell that is resistant to malaria. There's a mind behind that. There's a randomness though into how all that gets like shuffled around, because if you have a child, you're going to have a mix of the chromosomes of the male and the female, and that's a random thing that's happening there. But the information itself, the 12 chromosomes from each, is not random at all. It was actually created. But
I think the rest of it was, are all mutations random?
Yeah, I would say that they're all random.
And she has a follow-up of why don't we see in Asia? But feel free to answer if you want to, or just kick it over to Mark.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Go, Mark.
Okay.
Okay, so I think, and Stupid Trainer, certainly correct me if I'm wrong, because I know that you're way better on biology and genetics than I am. But I think she's alluding to an ERV, that if there's two genes and if one is activated, you get resistance to malaria. If the other is activated, you get sickle cell anemia. I think that basically what she's getting at is that if the people that had two genes activate and got sickle cell anemia are weeded out of the population. But I think, and do correct me if I'm wrong, SWE, this one is an ERV or an endogenous retrovirus that entered the lineage and caused that mutation to happen. Do correct me if I'm wrong. It might be co-opted functionality, but I'm not sure. I'd love for her to answer it, though. I'd like to know the answer.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that specific one. The ERV thing that you're talking about.
I can't remember. I'm not sure. That sort of came up in my mind, but don't quote me on that. I'm certainly not sure.
Okay. All right. And then Chris, if you had any follow-up.
Yeah, it ended up in the gene population where it is needed totally randomly. But it exists because it was created, it wasn't randomly assembled. If you want to... the reason that I say that it's random is because if you start out with a collection of non-living chemicals, the only reason they would assemble themselves into a living atom, like a living cell, the only way that would happen is if they somehow randomly ended up in the correct positions. It has to happen, right? It's not like there was a mind behind biogenesis. There's no mind behind getting a land-dwelling creature to evolve into a whale. No mind. It all has to happen randomly. Even though the process of variation in the genes, that's not random at all. It's because it was designed. It's an engineering. Yeah.
Well, a good follow-up for that would be from Leo Filius. Has anybody asked Christopher to define random yet?
Random. Blind. Chance.
Okay.
So no premeditated end result.
Mark, you got any pushback to that, or should we move on?
No predefined result. I'm sort of bewildered how that could happen in a universe that's been designed by somebody, but yeah. So my idea of random, would I don't know. I mean, you'd sort of relate it against deterministic, where the outcome is decided by the various input going into it. A random result would be completely arbitrary, where there is no input into the outcome. So a properly random occurrence would have no basis for the outcome, and should the entire parameters be replicated, you will get a different result, presumably. Are they?
Well,
Are they? Is that a question? Or?
I'm gonna try to break this down. Like if you have a forelimb and it's reducing itself into a fin where you can swim with it, that reduction of the 5-digit and everything like that is in an arm, or like any land-dwelling creature, if it has a hoof or if it has digits, it's going to have to randomly reduce itself and then randomly form into a fin. That all has to happen randomly. Even nature itself, is randomly changing to make this happen. So there's really, you can't deny the randomness in evolution theory. You can't deny it. If you do, I don't know how you do, because it's the process of random. I don't have a better response to that.
So it's not that the process is random, the parameters put into it are random. So just think about the dice example that I gave you. You roll the dice, and the dice rolling is random, but the process selecting which dice are higher is not a random process. So, I mean, nobody denies that there's randomness in evolution. Mutations are generally random. But the process itself is not random. It's determined by the environment. So that's no one's denying that there's random elements in evolution. It's just that, like the rolling of the dice, if you pick the highest one, you're going to get closer to 10 than 1, basically. If you roll 3 dice and pick out the lowest one, you're going to get closer to that 10, right? And then if you add another dice and roll it again, and keep taking the highest of what you're rolling, you're going to get to that number, definitely. With enough iterations of doing that, you're going to get there. That's not random. That's deterministic.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yes. Stupid horror energy. I was muted. I was trying to alert everyone to the fact that we have the bots in the chat. Making a little joke about that. Seems that you have taken care of them for us. And yeah. What's next?
Who's that one chick that did the flashing in the intro video? Is that one of your bots?
That is in fact Stupid Horror Energy.
Oh, okay.
Which is why you should never let her in on a live show. And we've got another question for her. No, I don't think this is a question. I don't know why that's in the stars. From organic perception, if biology was made, why would it be made to go against the law of the divine by the divine?
I don't see that it does go against the law. I mean, we have a natural conscience. You don't just your kid asks you for a piece of bread, you don't give him a stone. But if he asks for milk, you don't give him a scorpion. These are things that are just natural. Like even Mark was saying, that animals feel these things. And because of the fact that you can't show that they were evolved, I believe them to be designed. And if they're designed, but the design has been corrupted, well, then obviously you'll have certain things that contradict the laws of the divine. There's, his laws are supposed to be written in our minds and our hearts, but our minds and our hearts are weak and feeble and susceptible to lies and deception. So they'll feel things that are contrary to the laws of the divine because we don't live in a perfect body. It's been corrupted. Thank you.
And any follow-up, Mark?
Yeah, so like I said, and I was sort of asking this question. It is a good question, organic perception. Why would you design a body to feel these things if it goes against the same laws that you want to implement? It seems counterproductive would be the word I would use. But yeah, and I do agree with Chris. Animals do have natural conscience, and humans have a natural conscience. And the way we see that sort of played out is the more intelligent the creature and the more socially social the creature, how much it forms communities, the more we see that. So you can have intelligent animals like sort of cats, which are lone hunters, that don't sort of exhibit this kind of empathy and reciprocity that is essential for social creatures. So intelligence and social cohesion seems to be the two things relating to the implementation of this. And so I don't understand why, if we have these natural empathy and reciprocity and these natural conscience that we're talking about, why we don't just use that and dump the God.
I don't know. Move on to the next question.
Whoops. So, and I did misread this. This actually is a question. Doesn't God lie when he sends a strong delusion and when he sent deceiving spirits? For Chris.
No, it's not. a lie. If you're promising to do something good based on a certain condition, and then you meet that condition, and then God doesn't provide what he said that he would provide, that would be a lie. Now, if God says that he's going to do something, if, let's see, it's a lie if he promises something good based on a condition. You meet the condition and he doesn't provide it. That would be a lie. Sending you a deceiving spirit, like, in that there's a story in the Bible about a king who surrounded the wall of Israel, and he said, we're going to come in there and we're going to take anything. Don't be deceived by Hezekiah, your king. His God is not going to win in this battle. We're going to take your lands. You just need to submit. And then what ended up happening is God shows up and he sends a deception where something happens, and this king of Babylon, he hears a rumor that some other empire is coming to make war against him, so has to leave that area. That's not necessarily true that happened, but the king of Babylon is being punished for the wickedness he's trying to do. So God will bring evil on somebody, make them think that something good is going to happen, or what have you, present a false scenario so that they will, lose, so that they'll be punished in the end. But it's not like he told the king of Babylon, if you leave Israel, then I'll give you something good, or I'll spare your life. And then that didn't end up happening. It's not like the king of Babylon listened to God, left Israel, and then he still ended up dying or something like that. So there's kind of a difference between what is a lie and then deception. I'm trying to answer this. It's a question that I haven't thought about in some time, I suppose, but there's just a difference between a time of peace and a time of war. Okay, in war you lie, and that doesn't mean that it's not the same kind of a lie. I guess you have to look at what's happening. God is lying to people by sending them deceiving spirits, but this is to punish them. So he has the original intention behind the deception is to bring something evil upon them. They're already worthy to receive a punishment from God, and they're deceiving themselves really by believing all of these lies. So somebody comes and God sends a deceiving spirit. It's still their free will on whether or not they want to believe that spirit, but God knows that they will believe it, which is why he sends them. He allows them to play that out so that he can end up winning in the situation and be glorified. I hope that answers it.
All right. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I'm glad Stupid Horangi brought it up. Thank you so much. So the whole idea of God, I believe and I mean, I had to look this up as well. I'm not, crazy smart or anything, but the whole idea that God sanctioned this deceiving spirit to go out and put himself in the mouths of all of the prophets, so and tell lies, basically. Now, God never directly talks to anybody or sort of iterates directly to everybody. When he's talking, it's usually through a mouthpiece like an angel or something like that. So this whole idea that it's not a lie because it's a lie by proxy doesn't really stack up, because God is always using a proxy in order to relay his messages to the people. So as this sort of says, he deliberately sets up a deceiving spirit to lie to the people, and even approves this activity as what he ought to do. Now, if God's nature is the arbiter of what is moral, then that is what he ought to do. But it casts a lot of shade on the rest of the Bible. And how do we know that the people that penned the Bible weren't deceived by another spirit that God sent? So there's a problem here that undermines the entire Bible, sort of that theists don't really acknowledge. The other thing that Chris said is that in war you lie, kind of thing, and I agree. Like when you are in a situation, in order to preserve your society, you ought to. It is moral to lie to preserve your family and your people and minimize harm to everybody and increase well-being. I agree with that. But what you're describing is moral relativism, that in one scenario it's immoral and in another scenario it is moral, like in the time of war. So it sort of undercuts your entire absolute morals argument there.
Well, not if it's a part of the morals itself. If there's certain conditions, if if it's a law to do something, there could be exceptions to that law within the law, because things that happen. If somebody is chopping away at a tree and the axe handle flies off and stabs his partner beside him, that's just an accident. But it wouldn't be wrong for somebody to kill that person because they don't know it was an accident. All they know is that person died because of the other person. The other person's axe is in his neck, so it's nothing wrong with that. But then there's a circumstance, there's a condition with that law to where you have a special city where that person can go to, and then nothing bad can happen. But if he doesn't go to that city, he can what is known as the Revenger of Blood can kill him. So
okay,
there's relative moralism in the moral itself.
Well, I mean, what we're sort of talking about is morals, so what we ought to do. And I would argue in that case, we might not know it and we might be mistaken, but we still ought not to kill somebody who, caused death by accident. So the whole idea that we don't know that that's what happened, so we ought to kill them. I wouldn't say that that's the right stance to take, because when you're talking about morals, you're talking about what is the action we should take in these circumstances. So in these circumstances, ought to punish people who murder people? Yes. Or should we kill people who have caused a death by accident? No. So I'm not sure what you're getting at saying that there's the moral, because you're sort of conflating the law with morality. Which is sort of, the law says that if somebody dies by somebody else's hand and, they get a trial and not proved that they're innocent or they're found guilty, they should be put to death. That's what the law says. But that's not what morality says.
Yeah, it depends on if you have a natural morality or a divine morality. You have a natural morality, one that just comes from, I don't know where it comes from. Nature kind of decides what is right and wrong.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, why do you think that something is right or wrong? Because I think that that's relativism, whereas I have absolute morals. You have morals that are just relative to certain scenarios.
Well, no, not exactly. And I sort of touched on this, but I'll get into that a bit later. But sort of, so as far as divine morals that you're talking about, it sort of suggests that your morals, it is moral to kill that person who did nothing wrong because of divine morals. But wouldn't divine morals say that you still ought to kill that person because they didn't actually do that accident?
Yeah, but in that situation, a trial hasn't taken place. It just happened. So all the person who lost their loved one knows is that they are angry, and that person looks like he was murdered. They don't know anything.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the law. We're talking about what ought to happen. Sort of in a perfect world, what ought to happen to that person, right? That's what we're talking about with morality. What we should do in that circumstance, not what the law says to do, not what is emotionally gratifying. It's what you ought to do. And if you sort of say, well, divine, you ought to kill that person even though they've done nothing wrong, it seems a weird kind of morality for a divine being that knows they did nothing wrong.
Yeah, if you actually knew that it was an accident, yeah, it would be wrong. But if you don't know anything about what happened, then it's perfectly fine for you to seek vengeance for your dead loved one.
Okay. So if you don't know that it was an accident, it's moral to kill somebody who did nothing wrong.
No, I don't want to.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know. In this scenario, in the biblical law, I'm just saying, there's certain exceptions. Yes, it is wrong to kill somebody if it was an accident,
Right.
But if you didn't know that it was an accident, how can you make a law that says that person shouldn't die? Because that wouldn't be right.
You can't, but that's not the moral thing to do, right? If you found out later, hey, it was an accident, you would say, hey,
Right.
I did something really immoral, right? I killed somebody who did nothing wrong. It was an accident, right?
Yeah, but it wouldn't be held, you wouldn't be accountable for that because you didn't know there wasn't a trial that happened. That person didn't make it.
Yeah, we're not really talking about
going to be protected.
Yeah, we're not really talking about accountability under the law. We're talking about what is moral, right? So whether you ought to have done that or not. And I would sort of argue that, if you found out later that they were innocent and you killed them, then and regardless, even if you didn't find out, it would still be an immoral thing to do because they did in fact not murder anybody. It was an accident. That's my point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to the other one,
Right.
I do want to. I did briefly touch upon this, but you sort of said it's whatever the circumstances are. So I'm a meta-ethical relativist, right? So what that means is that you basically have a framework of what you are seeking within society, what you want out of society, how you want to get out of society. It's very sort of, so if we have an agreement that, hey, we both want the best for everybody in society, or we both want people's well-being to be people to be well in society, and society to flourish and grow and become more technologically advanced, things like this. If we agree on that, then we can make some objective designations of what is good towards that goal and what isn't good towards that goal. Like, for instance, we can say that, sort of sending people for education is good towards making the society flourish. That providing healthcare for people is good towards making the society flourish. And sort of, as far as an individual basis, sort of having good laws so people are protected is good for those people and it's good for society. So everything is measured against that framework of what we want out of society. So when you sort of say, hey, well, your morality is completely relativistic, well, no, my meta-ethics, the objective, the framework is relativistic because people want different things. But the decisions that I am putting into place, so the actual morals, with respect to that framework, are objective. So I know it's a sort of distinction, but it's an important distinction, that I may be arbitrarily deciding that my well-being, the well-being of others, and the well-being of society is important to me. But once we get that, it's not sort of my preference anymore. It then becomes, well, the decisions that I make, they are either good for that goal or bad for that goal, and it isn't preference from that point onwards.
Well, what if I was able to give you an ultimatum and say you had to choose between having morals come from God or having morals come from government? Which one would you choose?
I would probably choose government. I think that the problem with and I pointed this out earlier, the problem with the God moral thing is that even people that believe in the same God, even people of the same denomination of the same God, they can't agree on what the morality actually is. At least with a government, and depends on the government, really, doesn't it? I mean, if you're talking about like a democracy, it may be better than, say, a totalitarian society. So there's a lot of ifs there, but at least a government could put a strong framework that cannot be misinterpreted or interpreted differently and cause religious fractions and wars and things
You
like
really
that.
think that they could, though? I mean, look at what's happening in America.
Yeah, I think they could. I think that they could lay down a sort of following the veil of ignorance. I can't remember who first came up with the veil of ignorance. Is like you write laws according to as if you were the least represented person in that society. So you try to create a society that cares for the least represented member as well as the most represented member. And I think there are philosophies and sort of sort of social policies that we can put in place to further that. But again, it all depends on the government.
Okay. Well, this is a fascinating discussion, you guys, but and I hate to cut it off, but we do have a couple more questions.
Sorry.
Amy Newman asks, for Christopher, what would it take to convince you that the Christian God is not moral? Or is it by definition, if it exists, is it moral?
You'd have to show me God, authorizing something. Oh, you'd have to show me something God authorizing that is against his law, that's still applicable under the New Testament. Because like I said, ceremonial laws, dietary laws are no longer a part of that, but civil laws are still applicable. So if you were to send a prophet in modern times and they were to authorize something or teach something that's contrary to anything in the Bible, that would convince me that God is not moral. They would, of course, have to show themselves that they came from God. And I'm not sure how you could convince me of that, no matter who you are. I don't know. God would probably have to be physically conjured up. Like you'd have to bring Jesus here, and then he'd have to do something that he said was wrong in the Bible.
Okay. And before you respond, Mark, I think we can bundle these two questions together because they're very similar. Stupid Horror Energy asks, if Yahweh was actually a very powerful evil alien, would you be able to discern that? Very similar.
If he's an evil alien, could I discern it?
Could you tell the difference between that and if he was actually the God he claimed?
Just depends on how you define evil. I mean, if you read God's law and you think that that's evil, then I guess you'd have to say that God is an evil alien. But if you agree with everything and you think that it's right and it's just, then if God was an alien, you wouldn't be able to tell. You just think that, I don't know where the alien thing comes in here. If you can, I don't know what God looks like. He could look like an alien for all I know.
I think if say like there was a powerful evil alien who was pretending to be a god, would you be able to tell?
Yeah, but the only way I'd be able to tell is to compare their actions with the things in the Bible. Be the only way to tell.
Okay, Mark.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. The one doesn't apply to me. The other one is I just had a conversation with somebody who did think God was an alien or a race of aliens very recently on my channel. So Richard? Richard, that was interesting. He's a lovely guy. I think he's wonderful, but just some of his beliefs I really don't see how he got there. But that's okay. It was fascinating to talk to. But you probably couldn't. That's the thing. Like any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, or in this case, miracles kind of thing. So I don't think you could tell. What would it take to convince you the Christian God is not moral? Well, I mean, they'd have to exist first, and then I could be convinced they're not moral. There's a lot of things that God commanded in the Bible that I consider horrendously immoral. I mean, we've covered some of them today, especially the slaughter of the Midianites, and where they were told to take the young girls away kind of thing and sort of slaughter everybody else. So those are the kind of commands which sort of go against is thou shalt not murder kind of thing, which seems to only relate to Jews and the Israelites in their own tribe. It doesn't relate to other people going out and killing other people. So I think that God himself seems to display moral relativity, that these things are not absolute. There are instances where you go out and murder people, and there are instances where you do all these things, and there are instances where you send deceiving spirits and lie. I'm convinced that the concept of God that I've been presented with is a horribly immoral one right now. It's a long answer for an answer that I didn't expect to give. I'm sorry. I said I won't answer it and then talked about it for like 2 minutes. I'm sorry. Go for it. Next question.
Yeah, that happens. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we well covered those ones. And last question. This has been revised a few times. So your way, your way or Yahweh, tested by fire, asks, if you are presupposing God, according to what standard are you basing he would not be able to destroy rebels in light of the fact that your existence is based on his breath of life? And I'm
Tough
not
question.
sure who that one's for. It sounds like maybe Chris.
I don't think so. I think it's for me, to be honest with you, because he's sort of saying, if you presuppose God, what standard are you basing he would not be able to destroy rebels, right? So what's your justification under that presupposition that he wouldn't be able to do whatever he wants because he gives you your life? Does that make sense? That's how I'm reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, so go ahead and answer. Yeah.
Okay, so first off, the presupposing something, and I was talking to Snake Snake about this earlier. That presupposing something, you've always got to keep in mind that a presupposition, you always have the chance to be wrong. You have to keep in the back of your head that a presupposition has no justification and therefore could possibly be wrong. However, if I was presupposing that and considered it what I was based upon, the question is flawed, because basically you're saying that because God gave that life, because he endowed that life, he can take it away. So it's basically a bully mentality. The most powerful wins, and there's nowhere else in this world that we say, hey, because you gave something life, you can just take it. We don't do that for parents. We don't say, hey, you can just take life because you gave it. We don't do that for somebody that sort of grows something. There's no place that we would sort of accept this out of a parent, sort of giving birth to children, to take that life. But it's just basically the biggest cudgel wins. This is very the power based and just a morality based upon the biggest, strongest wins. So incredibly immoral, incredibly unjustified. He would not be able to destroy rebels because you don't get to decide what people do just because you're bigger and stronger. But I really don't want to engage with Terry. So over to you, Chris.
Well, he's the creator. He's given certain laws. If you break those laws, you get the consequences. So if he's going to destroy a bunch of rebels, it's because they've done something to deserve it. He would never destroy somebody if they didn't deserve it. That's God. Abraham, he asked God, if he would spare the city of Sodom and Gomorrah if there were 50 righteous, and he got all the way down to like 10 or 5 people, and God said that he wouldn't do it if there were 5 righteous people in there. So God would never do something cruel or inhumane. His law is perfect and just. If you disagree with that, then you probably think God is inhumane. But if you understand the benefits to keeping those laws, you wouldn't disagree with that. I just don't think that you've looked at them close enough, or that we've had a nation to give us an example of what it looks like to keep God's laws. We have a partial example, in the Bible, but there's really not a nation that's done this successfully. Only Jesus has done this. That's why you need him to be saved, FYI.
All right. And then, Mark, if you have any last words, then we can move on to the scoring portion.
Cool.
Alrighty. So, so I like to declare my biases before I give scores, and actually, I personally disagree with both debaters tonight. So,
Nice.
Yeah. So I don't have any overt biases, I guess, to declare. And as always, we try to judged based solely on performance, instead of whether we agree with someone or not. When we declare winners, it's we're not saying that we think that their conclusions are correct. It's just debate performance. And the goal of this channel is to improve the quality of debating, improve debate performance for individuals so they can just get better at debating in debates, in being convincing in just normal everyday things, just better at discussion. And again, the Q&A does not count, which would I think some points were made very clear in the Q&A, but again, that does not count towards the scoring. And I have my notes are on a few different pages, so let's see here. So yeah, let's see. We'll start with Chris since he went first. So it seemed like you kind of well, this goes into kind of the youth fro thing, where it seems like you kind of lacked the key definition of what really is morality. You said it comes from God, but then that doesn't explain what attributes God is actually using for his definition of morality. So that's kind of an important thing to get right off the base, is have a very clear definition for the subject matter that you're talking about, and strategically you want to have your opponent agree with you on that definition. But I thought both of you were quite respectful. You were pleasant and mellow dudes, and sometimes we like to see some blood sports, but these kind of conversations are also fun. So you were confident and pretty charismatic. I think the except when you start saying like people need to be put to death, which I didn't really count you off any points for, but it's just it doesn't come across particularly well. But if that's your position, stick to it. I didn't dock you for that. But just one of my observations. We do like talking to you, Chris. You are a good guy. But personally, I don't avow some of those things. But again, that has nothing to do with the scoring. Let's see here. You were reactive to Mark's points, which I thought, since you're on the affirmative side, you should be both sides should be active in making their points, but the affirmative really should not be the reactive one. And so you kind of let Mark lead you around with the topics a little bit. And again, especially if you're on affirmative, you need to be more active and kind of control what you're going to talk about, instead of because then you're going to be on defense the whole time, and you need to be able to put your opponent on their back feet. That's kind of the tug of war of debate, is the actual sport, in my opinion, is the skill. I think that's basically, you can know as much as you can have like book smarts, but the actual skill of debating that you need to learn, outside of just like knowing facts, is that tug of war of who's really in control. And the more, so what I mean by active would be, you ask him questions about his views and about your views, and kind of keep him on defense. And as far as that strategy goes, that kind of goes into strategy a little bit, but specifically, I think that it's a bit of a mistake to go with the I know you're saying that it's based in God, but the religious angle, it's almost irrelevant, because as a strategy, it seems like you were trying to say, if you can prove that there's a God or that there's some kind of supernatural, that would then prove that there is an objective moral law. And so I don't think that you need to prove that at all. Well, maybe not at all, but that would be something that you would need to get to down the line, because even if you establish that there is in fact a God, that wouldn't automatically establish that there's a absolute morality. And that's kind of demonstrated by some of the questions that we read, which is like, what if this God like is an evil God or some kind of just ultimate being, but is not really the benevolent being that it's claiming to be? So just because there's a God doesn't mean that there's automatically an absolute morality. And so I think that you needed to focus more on establishing what that absolute morality is before you establish that there's a God. So yeah, so you basically you would need to show us that God's absolute morals are true. So that's a different topic, basically, or a different point than whether or not God exists. So I think I wrote that down a few times. So there's if morals are real, then you could basically demonstrate that they exist without a God, even if they're from God, like math. So I would assume that you agree, God created the laws of physics, created math, or whatever the laws of math that make math work. But you can prove them independently outside of any theology. Sort of like you seem to agree that society going well, like you said, executing the right people would make society better. So I would have liked to see more exploration of like what exactly what makes a good society, not just an example of what a good society is, but like what attributes actually make a society make good, essentially. And you fell back on empathy a few times, which Mark picked up on toward the end, which I thought was real good. And I wrote this down, and then Mark picked up on it, that empathy, you fell back on empathy, and but a lot of the positions you were defending were really unempathetic. So there was that discord between kind of one of the points that you were using to kind of define good was like what's empathetic, what's good for society, and some of the examples you were defending were kind of at odds with that. And so that gave Mark the opportunity to kind of get a point there. And almost done. So I think I think that you did your good points were in like without moral absolutes, everything is permissible. I think that that's the strongest point, and I think the most important point for saying that there are moral absolutes. So I do actually agree with you that there are moral absolutes. I don't agree that it comes from God's. But in the debate, I don't think that we need to disagree that much, because I think you can show that they exist independently of a God, even if you believe they're from gods. And so I think, and this will come into some of my criticisms for Mark, is you can kind of show that there are universals and absolutes across moral codes, or at least successful moral codes, and I think you should go there next time you debate. And let me see. I think that's about about it for my criticism for you, Chris, or feedback. I don't want to categorize it all as criticism. But yeah, basically, yeah, I would say go with trying to just prove you can still use God, but I think you need to demonstrate what good is first. And then as for Mark, forgive me, my notes are on 3 different pages, so just getting a little bit organized. So, Mark, I think so. It's a little bit difficult to give you too much constructive criticism, although I think I actually got some good stuff down. Because Chris was mostly on defense. So again, Chris, if you were a little bit more active on offense, then I think you could, that's really when you start finding the cracks in your opponent's beliefs. And you did a little bit, but again, you would push back and give, you would attack Mark's positions, but Mark was in control of what positions were being talked about, it seemed most of the time. So, yeah, Mark, you did well on offense. I do think that a few times, when you brought up like what would be a better society and this and that, I was a bit confused because it, like Chris said, it's like how can you say something is better or worse if there is no absolute standard. So I would have liked to see a bit more. Chris, you could have been a bit more aggressive on that point. I think that is you really should have seized on that. Let's see. So Mark, I think in the middle there, it seemed a little bit meandering in the conversation. I think maybe more aggressive on the inconsistencies of the Bible. I know you brought it up, but I think framing it more as you say, what I mean more is like you said it, the killing of the tribes, it's inconsistent with the commandment for murder, but like what I mean more is the inconsistency of the act itself is like on a logic level, just killing. I think you could have gone into more of why killing actually is wrong, and why it would be wrong for a God to order that, because like on a like with you brought up the veil of ignorance, on a veil of ignorance level, you can't really make that, you can't give a rule that would allow for the killing of some tribes over here and not other tribes over there. So that's kind of what I mean. And the idea of some of the things that I wrote down, you actually got to in the end, which was good. But the criticism I would have there is don't save it for the end, bring it up much earlier, because what I felt was the real meat of the conversation was kind of brought up in the last 10-15 minutes, like the Euthyphro dilemma. I wanted more of that, so I gave you I actually bumped your point up one for the bringing up that, but it was in the last minute, so you could have gotten a lot more, not the actual last minute, but metaphorically last minute, because you had about 45 minutes before that that I wanted to hear more on that. So yeah, I think we some of the questions that we brought up, Amy's and stupid horror energies, like how do you discern which God to listen to, and whether God is correct or it's even the correct God, I think we could have gone more into, because those are definite weak points with Chris's argument in a whole. I think we went down there a little bit, but again, I think that there was a lot of time that could have been more dedicated to those, and you could have really interrogated him and really put his feet on the fire with that. So you did go into that, but I think bit of a lost opportunity to really grill him, and yeah, could have just had a little bit more focus on those topics. And so this is partial criticism for both you guys, I guess. So I thought when you brought up the proto morality, it kind of seems to be the opposite of what you claim, because it does show a consistent rule set across animals and humans and societies, where there is this stable behavior set that kind of makes societies work. And that but Chris didn't really pick up on that or push back on that, so I think that would have been a really great place to attack Mark on, Chris, because it would seem that if there are laws basically in the universe that are kind of making certain behaviors stable, it would seem that there maybe are some absolute truths concerning behavior and I guess morality. And yeah, I think you touched on, why should it matter that God actually was, if God wrote the Bible and made these proclamations, why does that matter? You did with the youth of Fro, but again, I think that should have been the heart and soul of the debate. Maybe that's just me because I love that dialogue, but you were pretty consistent about saying that Chris is just asserting, he's not actually demonstrating what this God commands actually is in fact moral, because you can't distinguish it between an evil God or an evil alien, etc., etc. And you were right to ask near the beginning, what are these moral facts behind what God is declaring is right? And if it's from God, morals can change. I think that was one of your best parts, where you had his feet to the fire. And Chris, you kind of basically conceded a few times. I think one of the better ones was actually in the Q&A, but actually, but I don't count that in the score. But there were a couple times, Chris, that you basically, Mark had you on God, basically God's nature can change and God's rules can change. And so you could, that was very good from Mark. And I would have liked to see more of that with some of the other topics that I wanted more on. So hopefully that wasn't too scatterbrained for you guys. And that is, hopefully that makes some sense to you guys. And if you have any questions, quick questions or extended questions, you can email me. What do you think, guys?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Snake. That's fair. I totally get you. And I want to.
I forgot the actual scores.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry.
Okay, so one sec. So Chris, I gave you a 72. I thought. I did forget to say Mark had many more sources, which were in his opener. which helped him with content. I think you could have made them a little more relevant during the discussion, but it was still good. And you really clearly defined your definitions. So, Chris, you weren't as high in content and strategy were the biggest differences. So again, your strategy of saying God exists, therefore absolute morals exist. There's a couple steps missing in between that. And then style, you guys were both pretty similar in that. So I gave you a 72, Chris, and then Mark. Since you were in control the whole time, you had your great sources. You had the definitions very clear in the beginning, and you had a few concessions from Chris. I gave you 91, and it could have been a little higher if again with the if the Euthyphro and things like that were more central to the discussion. But yeah.
Yeah, no problem. No, I hear you. Yeah, that's a very good argument that could have been fleshed out a lot more. No, I get you. I understand. That's not a problem.
Okay.
But thank you. Thank you.
And you guys both did well, but trying to nitpick as much as possible so that we push ourselves to be the best.
I do disagree with something that you said though vehemently, that Christopher got a lower score than Jill did my last debate. I'm really sorry, but Christopher behaved so much better, was so much more rational. I disagree with you completely. Could you please lower Jill's score from the last debate so it's a lot lower than Christopher's? Because I just want to say thank you, Christopher. It was a really good conversation. I kind of forgot halfway through we were kind of debating, I just sort of was really good to talk to you and just engage with you and sort of explore what you think about that. It was a really good debate, I thought.
And I will say I've been trying to be a little harsher actually on scoring. So I do agree Chris is I think he probably got a higher score on style. That's behavior wise. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that you're right on me not like going on the offense. Like I should have been more offensive. So I'm definitely going to try to work on that. I think
aggressive but respectful.
Was stopping me on that. We just didn't have enough time for me to get. I had a little more points that I wanted to respond to. So.
Well, don't
for
feel
me,
bad
it helps
about it.
having like the list of like a few your main points. You basically know how you're going to go about using them, but just have that list there so always recenter the focus back on those things that you really want to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And I'm very good at controlling that conversation. I've got a lot of experience in it in the past, so don't feel bad, Christopher. I sort of I'm very good at doing that, and that's not a negative. It's just it's how we react to one another. But I think also maybe, and this is just a suggestion, do feel free to ignore me completely, but maybe going to other sources, like maybe some scholars that have talked about absolute morality in reference to the Bible, and some other papers that, because I mean they're out there. People have done some philosophy on it, and even going to Immanuel Kant and looking at what he said about absolute morality and things like that. It may have helped you a lot in sort of, instead of just leaning so heavily on one book, that you have some other sources to say, hey, this is what philosophers believe and this is how this was interpreted, and sort of present that to back up the things you were saying. Would probably be a better idea, but you can ignore me if you want. That's fine. It's not a problem.
I thank you both for your criticism. It'll make me a better debater in the future. I don't plan on stopping anytime soon.
Awesome. Well, I'd look forward to seeing you in the ring again, Christopher. You're fantastic to talk to, mate. It was really pleasant.
Likewise, I congratulate you on the victory tonight.
Oh, thank you, sir. And definitely a good performance. Like I said, the last one was against Jill, and that was something. I don't know if it was a debate, but it was something. It was crazy. So I really enjoyed this. I just want to make that clear.
All right, guys. Well, thank you both for coming, and we'll try and get a real interesting topic for you guys soon. rematches, if you want to do that, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. And you know, we can sort out a topic and stuff. I'd love to do some more debates toward the end of the year. And Christopher, you were great to talk to, so I'm more than happy to do that. But
Awesome.
Yeah,
Not
and
a problem.
I did mean to say I have been super like I've been out of town like for work.
no, I know, mate. Yeah,
I haven't been able to schedule very much, but that'll all be over mid-December, so we'll be able to pick up more frequently. And then over the next week too, if anyone wants to debate, you know, with pretty soon this week, this next week, I've got nothing but time with that as well. So
I
yeah,
will
and
debate
thank
you
you
on
for to the
absolute.
audience.
I will debate you on absolute morality as well.
Yeah,
If you
we
want.
got it. We
I
got to
would
set it
be.
up.
I would be happy to, Snake, sit you down and give you the Mark Reid treatment. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we need some guest judges too, so that they can judge me, along with Cinematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and
and we
thanks to
don't
the
want just
audience.
all like atheists. I know Leo's been a guest judge. Yeah, maybe Chris could be a guest judge. So, yeah.
Has there ever been like a debate where, you know, there's one topic and then you have like 3 or 4 different people that they differ all with each other?
Like
I
a
think
panel, like a panel kind of thing, a panel debate.
We I have done an open mic. I want to do more open mics as well, when I have more time. And so yeah, we'll do that. Hasn't been a 4-way like formal debate. Maybe we'll
like
try and
we
figure
have
out a
different
format for that.
views on moralism. Like all 3 of us
Mhm.
have a different view on moralism.
Mm.
So if there was like a debate where each person, like, you know,
Yeah, we should do a panel on that soon.
Been madness. Have you done a 3-way?
yeah.
Not this kind.
Okay. Just thought I'd throw that out there. And thanks to the audience. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you do like debates. Hit the bell for notifications. I know how I have. So yeah, please do that.
Yeah, we need more watch hours to get monetized. So the more thumbs up or the more debates you watch and the longer you watch, pull them up on all your devices and watch them all. So that'll help us out. And yeah, thanks guys.
Thank you, Snake.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
And we'll see you guys again soon.
Deuces.
I'm gonna have to come up with some kind of clever sign out, but goodbye is all I got for now.
That was fantastic.
Until